recording started. Yeah, so this is the session to actually discuss the CRD proposal with the community, right? So basically, what we wanted to do, so I shared, I think the document yesterday is, yeah, there has been all kinds of different approaches on how to define the CRDs that would be the release 1 flavors to actually start from. So we did not change. So I'll go through the document, right? And then I wanted to zoom in on the core principles and also the changes and probably why we have done so. And then, okay, the whole idea is to open discussion. I think there is a number of things that probably still need more fine tuning and stuff like that, but at least I think the big picture should be, we are trying to ensure that that is done, right? So John, can you do the moderation maybe for when people ask questions and stuff like that, because it's hard to.
Sure. Yeah. I'll watch the hands. So we have a hand from Bala.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. I just want to ask a very fundamental question for all of us. Is the new document replaces the old document? It supersedes it or complements it? Can you please tell me?
The idea is that this would be the our release 1 CRD, so it replaces it. And I created a separate document because there were some fundamental changes. And okay, that's another discussion. I'm happy to merge it to the other side, but you'll see the content will be what is here probably. And of course, depending on the feedback, but this would be the new proposal, and this would be the reference going forward.
Okay. So the reason I asked, because it missed some of the instance set, enough instance set. So we are not doing that.
It's gone. So and we will explain why we did that.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's basically gone.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. That's it. Yeah.
So it's actually still there, but not explicitly. It's implicitly still there, but not explicitly. And that's probably something important to get to. Because I maybe just to answer that question, Bala, if you look at the blueprint package, I think you have gone through the document. So a package instance, right? So that contains what we call a blueprint that represents that deployment is actually an NF instance, or you could say it's the original NF template, or it's the original NF instance set, but the instance set was actually referring to a template somehow. So, but it's still there, but it's not explicitly called out. And the reason why, and I think Tal was basically the one that was proposing that, is that, and actually I agree with him, is that if we build a construct like an NF template or an instance set, we are constraining ourselves to purely packet core. And so the whole idea that Tal had was, and Tal, please correct me if I'm wrong, but is to make it more composable. And so what Tal proposed is that, okay, we have a package, which is a great asset. So let's define individual components in there that we could reuse later on, potentially for other use cases. Of course, it's all a bit hypothetical, but for example, rather than defining an NF template or an NF instance set and what have you, we built a package which still represents something like that, but it has composable CRDs that are within it that as a whole represents that entity, right? So, and as such, we have a more, let's say, flexible and composable system that probably is for futuristic use easier to adopt and complement.
Yeah, that was a good, very good a way of saying it. Yeah, my own take on this is that it's really that, but I would call these. I'm trying to get us to have building blocks that we can assemble use cases rather than starting kind of from the top from a use case and then going down. And I'm also under the assumption that we all shared that there are higher level orchestrators, right? There's OSS, there's service orchestration, there's all this stuff above that will give us those topologies, right? So we're not saying the topologies don't exist. They do exist, absolutely. But, and we'll probably have to reference them in some way if we're doing any kind of end-to-end, demonstration of how Nefio could work. But at the end of the day, those topologies are very use case, telco specific and all that. So if we focus on building blocks, then I think we'll be able to do anything, right? Anything that users assemble into.
Yeah,
But yes,
if I can just say, this is actually very much in line. If you go back and look at the principles that we talk about of using, it's the same thing we talk about where we're saying, rather than build an abstraction for something, use the existing Kubernetes APIs in the sort of original discussion or principles. Use the original Kubernetes APIs because we all understand those APIs and we can construct things out of them. So what the term we've used for this in their kept world is what we call package as interface. So rather than having an abstraction that sits on top of it that provides a constrained interface, you have an open package that people can modify and change. So like all of our condition stuff is based on this principle. And so what we're doing is actually taking that same principle and applying it up the next level and saying, yeah, we don't need an abstraction for that use case. We can just take the building blocks of that use case and put them into a package and collect them together by association. And it's way more flexible. And as long as we understand those underlying building blocks, we can operate on that as a set much more effectively and much more extensively. So it's actually really great way to, it's again applying our principle again, and not creating rigid abstractions that aren't strictly necessary.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Okay.
Can you
So,
lower your hand, Vala, just so, yeah, thank you.
okay. So basically, okay, we still, okay, we need, so we still at the moment have a core class and a core topology, and maybe core is probably also debatable as a name, I think. So if people have suggestions, we are open for that. But so everything still so starts at the top, because just to give you a reference, in core, you have packet core, you have voice core, you have a core in networking. So probably something probably the name will have to be changed. But yeah, so the idea is to basically, core is basically a collection of various components that represents, at the moment, I would say it's typically, or at least in Nokia, we call this packet core. It's an assembly of this, and there's a high level construct that would do that. Maybe before, John, so the idea also here is, based on some discussions, some people believe that this should not be a complete standard-based Nefio CRD, but more of a reference or a reference proposal on how that would look like. John, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that, this is all a discussion. So, but based on what we were just saying about what Tal was saying and what what we were just talking about, like, we probably can actually treat what's represented in this document in your core class as just another package. It's like taking it up that level. So like, I think maybe we should just go through this.
Yeah,
just keep an open mind that this is a proposal and this is under discussion. We're not saying it's fully baked. I think that we can actually take it a step further and actually construct these core classes just as packages. And the topologies would be embedded in those packages too, which is what Wim said right in the beginning, but I'm not sure the document reflects that.
That's true. It's not there at the moment. Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
Now, I think another philosophy behind the proposal here is the following: is that, okay, so basically the main building block is the packages, right? So the packages that represents a specific network function deployment, right? And how do these packages get established, right? It's basically coming out. So typically what you have is people say, I need a core. At the moment we defined 3 criteria, but probably that's up for debate. So we basically said it's either the capacity, and we made like small, medium, large. There is the purpose. So what I see in a lot of implementation is a lot of people segment for enterprise customer, like, or even private wireless or mass market. So that would be a reflection of purpose, or location could also be relevant if we are, for example, I think in Verizon, they have regional deployments. I know that certain enterprise, they have very targeted areas where they operate. So that was the idea. But in essence, that's more the orchestration side of things. But basically, the essence is the package, right? So what a package is actually a reflection of a conversation or a set of discussions that are happening between the persons that say, okay, this is what I would like to achieve, with the experts like the network function engineers, the infra engineers, and the network service designers. Together, they basically say, for this flavor of a core, these are the set of characteristics, or these are the content that that package should contain. I need 1 interface, I need 2 interfaces, I need SRIOV for this, I need this. And so the package contains, let's say, mainly the infrastructure requirements that such a flavor of a deployment has. And that's kind of the baseline. So the way that package gets established is through that conversation of these various people, or roles, as we call them, that basically together define it, and they document that into that package, which represents a flavor of that core type of thing. Okay, so maybe I'll pause here to see whether there is question. And there will be a package per type, so per NF type. So there would be 1 for UPF for that flavor, 1 for SMF, and 1 for AMF in that flavor. So that's basically the idea. Okay, if that's clear. So, and as such, Bala, back to your point, at the end of the day, there's kind of an NF template that we had originally, but because we don't have, I wanted to do this abstraction and yada, yada, yada. That's why the package, as John and Tal was saying, is reflecting that. And it's a better way of doing so, because we believe it's way more composable going forward and more flexible, right?
Cool, thanks.
And it applies to the principle of config as data that we introduced in Nefio, by the way, because as such, you basically, you see what you get, it's all in there. It's composed without building another abstraction layer, right? So, yeah, so one other important aspect, and that's maybe, okay, relevant, maybe less for release 1, but probably relevant going forward, is, okay, we have, at the moment, we define the role for network function, and we define the role for infra, basically. At the moment, infra is rather empty at this stage, but we believe that there would be a separate package going forward for infra. And the reason is that the life cycle of that infra could be different than the core instantiation. To give you an example, and that will be the case in release 1. For example, networks will be predefined, so we will set them up probably during our Ansible playbooks or whatsoever, and then a core uses it, right? So the idea also is that would be a separate package, because the lifecycle of those two would be independent. Okay, Tal, you have a point or a question or a comment?
Yeah, just a quick comment, and I might be, Bala, I might be presuming your question too, right? Because of course I'm familiar with how Red Hat manages infrastructure, and it has the completely different sets of CRs with ACM and all that policies. So you know, just to add to Wim's point, it could be a kit package, but you know, if it needs to interface with something like ACM, it could be, you know, ACM concepts and things, right? So I don't think it has to stay in the kit package world here. We're leaving this as a placeholder for now. As Wim is pointing out, we're not really doing much with it, but it is a place where we can elaborate with more proposals in the future when we actually get to infrastructure.
Yeah, so what I would add to that, in fact, and say that this is where we get to where we've talked about in the past of separating the APIs or the resources that define the provisioning and the resources that define the consumption. So we don't care how you've provisioned your infrastructure from the point of view of our packages that deploy network functions. What we care about is how to access that infrastructure and how to specify our requirements on that infrastructure. How you provision it could be manual, like Wim was saying. It could be with something like ACM. It could be with something completely different that's out of band effectively from Nefio, or it could be something like that's KRM managed and therefore can be also part of the management plane of Nefio. And so, but the consumption piece, so we have a resource, for instance, in here, like Wim was saying, that's kind of empty, that defines a network. That's from the point of view of how these network functions need to connect. It's not from the point of view of what you need to know in order to provision that network. And so we use this same trick. At some point, if we want to do the provisioning as part of Nefio, what we do is we create a package that represents that network for provisioning purposes, but sitting in that package is an additional resource that identifies it for consumption purposes. So that's how the two get tied together when you're provisioning it with Nefio. It's the same thing we talked about doing with clusters. If you're not provisioning it with Nefio, you might have a controller running within Nefio that discovers it based on your CMDB or your inventory system or whatever you have, populates that resource into the Nefio management cluster. Now, from the point of view of our network function deployment layer, it's just as consumable as if Nefio had deployed it. So this is the decoupling between how we provision, which could be in or out of Nefio using other technologies or not, but we can still consume. Yeah, Tal.
Yeah, sorry, so many points on this, but another aspect could be here interfacing with existing site inventories, right? Because many of us are familiar with ONAP A and AI, and other orchestrators have their own inventory management. Just to underscore John's point that it is out of band for Nefio. Of course, we don't interface with all that. Those are huge systems in themselves, but this is the connection point, right? This is where we would be able to connect to those other systems. And I think we're all interested to actually see how that would really work, how you integrate Nefio. But obviously for R1, we're not going to do this, but all the people are interested in this topic. And I know there are a lot because, in December and January, we had several meetings talking about CRDs for clusters and requirements. We kind of abandoned that avenue for now because we really need to focus on the release, but I do expect there'll be a lot of interest in working on this later.
Yeah, thanks, Tal, John, and sorry, I didn't raise my hand. I'll raise it. So at this point of time, we are only talking about network infrastructure components that is required for the 5G core functions as defined here, right? Just want to make sure we're not defining the actual cluster creation or anything at this point.
But not at this point, but going forward, that would be, I think, in the release. So just to be clear with everyone, I think, what is the name again? The person from Arna, Sandeep, I think.
Sandeep, yeah.
Sandeep is, he has so there is one of the issues in our project plan. It's a stretch goal to actually do something for cluster provisioning, but it's kind of nice to have. So it's like, but it's not a huge focus. But yeah, it's he's working on it.
So let me just sort of describe how that fits in here. It comes down to what we're trying to deploy is how it expresses its requirements. When we're deploying a network function, we're already implicitly saying it's going on some cluster somewhere. So that sort of already has to have been done. But in the network function package, it needs to express that it needs to connect to some network. So we need that resource. Now we also do need, we're basically sidestepping this cluster issue with a couple of assumptions. One assumption is that we have repositories associated with workload clusters. So now we don't need to know about clusters, we only need to know about repositories. So once we need to know about repositories, the thing that consumes repositories is the package variant set thing that fans out. That's all it needs to know about is where a repo is and how to put something in it. And so we're kind of sidestepping the cluster issue by associating individually with a repo. If we wanted to provision clusters, we just have to, we can do it any way we want. We just have to populate a repo resource. Like that connects up to it. Later, R2, 3, 4, whatever it is, we're going to break those assumptions and it's going to get more complicated. But for now, we kind of are like just sidestepping it. Tal, because I think Val, your hand's up because you,
Yeah, Val, go first, please. Oh, Val. Okay, yeah, I just wanted to add, I know this is such a deep topic, but to add to John's point, yeah, a repository is our equivalent, a Git repository is our equivalent of a site. I'll just mention too that there's enough flexibility that it doesn't have to be a one-to-one relationship between site and Git repository. It could be a directory within a Git repository. So, you know, in terms of scalability, that might be, you know, thousands and thousands of Git repositories, but it could be managed in a different way. And I'll also point out that, you know, for Google deployments, we're using config sync, right? So for us, the Git repository is a very trivial way to be a site because anything we push to the Git repository, config sync pulls it to the cluster, to the workload cluster. So I know there are other ways to reach workload clusters, but again, for Nefio, it's kind of just out of scope, at least at the moment. And that's how we're treating it right now. It's simple enough for us.
we're building these, we're making these very constraining assumptions for R1. And exactly. Because we need to reduce degrees of freedom. But like, eventually we'll have to break those.
Also, I think maybe important to understand, I think Tal touched in the comments already. So if you look to vendor specific capabilities, for example, let's say, okay, I have a certain flavor of a core and in the package. So there is two ways potentially to add vendor specific pieces. One is you put your own CRD in it, which is there, right? So that's one option. Second option is that we have like these references within each of our CRs that reference specific additional components. So also this allows vendor specific capabilities that, for example, we have not defined, but for example, the vendor wants to have. You could augment this package with that type of information if need be. Right, so that's maybe also another important thing to understand.
Yeah, and I even think that for demo purposes, I mean, we could just put something in there with a fake vendor, even though nothing is using it, just to show as a placeholder. Again, I just love this placeholder idea because it allows us to put things in R1, even though we have no implementation, right? So we can just put some vendor CRD there with fake information, right?
Yeah, we did a little bit like that in the workshop with the image config thing, but like I think that what's going to make this clearer, I think, is some example packages. Yeah. And I think Wim has some examples of individual CRDs here, but like I think we need to take the step further and make some example packages. And we'll also will find mistakes in how we're doing things, but like that will probably help us make it a little bit clearer.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to discuss or highlight the thought around it so that people.
No, I think this is a good discussion. I just don't, I worry that it's difficult for everybody to follow because there's a lot of context that might be hard. But let's continue. We're halfway through our time.
Yeah, so basically, if you look at it, that's the high level concept behind the idea. Okay, I don't know whether there is any major objections to this approach or not, but that's kind of the highlight. Then so the next step would be to go to the details. So there's two ways that we can do is we can go through each of the details CRDs, or we can go through the example. I don't know what you guys believe is the best.
Maybe the examples are easier to follow than the schemas.
That's also what I thought, but Stephen asked me to put it at the back, so I put it at the back. So the order has changed.
Yeah, well, you're supposed to talk about primitive first, and then you're saying that how to use the primitive. I thought that's actually much more
Well,
logical.
it's
Because
more logical.
examples can change. I mean, we may have different examples.
Yeah, for sure.
Or
That
all
for
one
sure.
thing, yeah.
And that's
I don't know. I'll let other people. To me,
Yeah, I
usually
mean,
looking
that would be
at
my
the example
interpretation.
first is easier than looking at the abstract thing, right? You look at a concrete example, and then you go back and look at the abstract thing, and then you go back and look at the like it's back and forth.
No, but this is a CLD spec. This is not a use case spec. That's the difference.
yeah. So it should be what I think to your point, Stephen, and I agree, is this should be a separate document or a separate repo or whatever. I do agree with that point. I just see, in order to get a concept understood, right? I think it's both important to understand the details of the CRD, which is actually the scope of the document, but I also bolted on the examples into it. But I do agree with you. Actually, we should separate that and maybe have different example documents or even repos where people actually see what is actually behind.
Right.
I agree with that. Yeah, because otherwise the scope is too big and
I mean, we are providing examples implementation too as a community, because otherwise it's just a CLD. It does actually nothing. But then for our one, we'll kind of have to identify what those are. But then for now, we publish CLDs. We are publishing the primitives.
Yeah. So what does people take, looking at an example or going through the abstract to the CRD details? I would propose to go to the example, but I'm open for other suggestions.
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine with either. Yeah, that's fine. Let's go through examples in the interest of time. Yeah.
So basically, okay, so and also, by the way, some of the text there is not so I also try to explain a little bit what should happen. There is also some pieces that needs to be aligned with what Aravind has presented and where what happens. So there is some work to be done here. So, and as such, at the moment, there are two individual CRs here. So the first thing that you start is core class, and core topology could be associated in a package, right? At the moment, it's presented as two individual CR, but this also can work when they are presented in a package. So this is basically, I want a core for the mass market, right? So that's the example, and it starts with capacity large, right? So the topology was, the idea was, okay, it would give some more context around it, that we say, okay, an AMF, I'm going to deploy always centrally. It has a certain capacity of large, and then the SMF would be deployed on all the regions, and the UPFs would be deployed on all the edges, right? So that's just an example. And so that would be the input that we would get. Now, this again would be a reference thing. So that's not our main. So that's not the true blueprint packages that we talked about. So this will actually give us information on which blueprint package that we are going to use, right, or consume. Okay. And as I said here, that has to be detailed. But so basically. So here is
a quick question. So we are assuming here that there will be a controller that will actually translate this into the packages, right? The package variants.
Yes, in the moment, that is our assumption as a reference implementation, right?
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Just clarifying.
Yeah, this is the area I mentioned in the beginning, where I suspect, like, we might leave that to humans and just construct packages rather than having a controller. It's less code to write and less, but I don't want to destruct. I don't want to digress. Like, I think package plus association might be sufficient for core topology and core class, but we can debate that later.
Yeah. So yeah, in essence, what you have is there is a blueprint package, and then okay, if we do fan out and stuff like that, there will be the content of this will be per repo represented where that NF and where that so based on the cluster, a certain NF type will be deployed. So what I'm representing here is actually how that package looks like in the beginning, and based on the selection criteria, right? So what would be in that package? So, and these would be the CRDs that actually Nefio mainly focus upon. So this would be, I call it network attachment. So this represents on how that core would be connected, or one of the attachments on how that core would be connected to the network. So, and these are all individual CRs that are all contained in the package. So there would be one network attachment for N3. So what we say, it's connected to this network. We say this is an SRIOV type and it uses VLANs. Okay. So for the N4 interface, so this is an example of a UPF, by the way. So here we say this is the N4 interface. It would be an IP VLAN CNI type. It's also a VLAN and it connects to this network, right? And then we have N6, very similar. Also, it uses SRIOV instead of IP VLAN, for example. This is just an example. Then, capacity. This is a point of discussion, I think, whether we have to split a separate CR for control plane or data plane. So at the moment in the current CRD, it's a single capacity that has actually 4 attributes or 4 properties. One is the uplink and so max uplink, max downlink, and then max sessions and max subscribers. I think there is people which have probably different opinions on that. So, but at the moment, that's one CRD that has these 4 properties. Of course, for a UPF, I picked only the throughput ones, but it's just that's how you show the or potential flexibility. I'm not saying that this is the way to do it. And then we also have a data network name that a DNN that is the internet. And we say we need a pool, and we can have multiple pools if you want to extend it, that has a certain size and how it's connected to the network. So this would be the content of such a package that represents a certain flavor of a core. So for example, if you would have private wireless as an example, you could say I only have one network. So you only have one network attachment instead of 3. And you could say, so the CNI type is Mac VLAN or something else, right? And I don't use VLANs, but I just have a native interface, so without any sub interfaces upon. That's also possible. So that's basically for each of these, what I call core deployment types. This is the content of such a package that represents something like that. And how gets this established is, first of all, vendor input, right? That together with the network function designer and the infra engineers and the network service designer collectively gets established, and that those packages would be put into the system, and you have different flavors for various use cases and deployment scenarios. And yeah, that's basically the idea. So I sometimes also, another way of expressing it is, if you look today, you go to a public cloud and you say, I need a flavor of a virtual machine, and here are some characteristics. It has to be 16 CPUs and so much memory and this disk. So it would be something along those lines of how a blueprint package, what it would be. Okay, any questions or comments around this? Okay, and so yeah, Bala. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Wim. I think it's really appreciate you putting this example together. It's very helpful. So as I was going through this last night, I had this thing in mind. So essentially, we're talking about particular flavor for a 5G core deployment. Then we are almost assuming a greenfield deployment where every function is going to be deployed. So since I mean, I'm not from a, I don't work for a service provider, so I don't know about this. But are we considering the cases where, for example, these things are from different vendors and something, let's say UPS is already deployed, or they're
See,
using this to deploy only one function? I just want to make sure if I think that may be a valid case in my view in a more brownfield area. And then in that case, just want us to think through how this particular workflow is gonna work for that. Yeah.
you want to respond, John, or should I?
I'm happy to. Yeah, I have something to say there, but I'm sure you do too. I think this is actually a great point, that why we might do it as a package instead, because then it's not up to us. It's up to that particular organization and that conversation that Wim talked about. And they'll say, huh, in our organization, we want to offer this ability to deploy this core, but we've already deployed these parts of it in these environments. So in this particular package, it's only going to include this function, and it's going to be constrained in this way, and it's going to be pointing to some other piece of infrastructure or other piece of the core that already exists. And so it's that composability, that flexibility in packaging things willy-nilly, really, is what would allow us to do what you're saying.
Yeah, I was thinking in the same lines, John. Just wanted to make sure that my thought process is the right way. Yeah, thank you so much. John.
But it's a line now. Of course, we have to look at all the details. But for example, one of the examples so this is one type, right? But for example, if you say mass market as the starting point that we say, you could say it's Ericsson AMF, it's Nokia SMF, and it's affirmed UPF or something like that. It's possible, right? And you could even say for this flavor, for example, what I see in a lot of use cases happen is for mass market, they have a certain vendor for a certain type. For enterprise, they have different flavors of the vendors, right? So what you do is you basically build the packages based on the flavors and the selection process that people have done, and they have the flex. So it's that conversation that allows them to build the right components together and make it composable. That's, I think, in my view, the beauty, the nice thing about the proposal on the table is that we don't define this predefined abstraction CRs, but it's actually a collection of things, and then the composability is up to the consumer rather than us trying to define every use case, which is probably impossible.
Yeah, makes sense, Wim. Yeah.
So yeah, and then here, so we have to update stuff, and that's also, I do agree that it's better to split this document than or these things off, that we have one way to describe this, but then our hydration process would kick in, right? And so then the injector starts to get, so I try to give here an example of the UPF deployment. So, and Bala, to your point, yeah, most likely this might already have been included into the package based on what Aravind presented. So I did not align that yet, but I just wanted to represent that, okay, this would be expanded. And then later on, when we have IPs and VLANs, it would be resolved and updated and what have you. So, but this is kind of the hydration stuff that we talked about that would be applied to the system. Yeah, Tal?
Yeah, so this is a question, really. I'm not exactly sure how it would work myself, but there would need to be some sort of hydration controller, right? And it's not merely use case specific, it's also vendor specific, right? Because different UPF implementations from different vendors would need different properties here. I don't know if we'll do it as an extension or, the meta model, we haven't really finalized that, but it goes back to, my presentation on Kplug. Like, would the idea be that every vendor has their own controller doing this? Or could we have a central controller that manages hydration, allowing for vendors to plug in their own code to handle that, right?
Yeah.
We are only doing free 5GC, right, for use case. So that's very straightforward, but we probably should take into account that there would be other implementations.
So I think, so maybe John, can I first go first?
Yep,
So,
go ahead.
give a view. So there is, I see different flavors. So in R1, our controllers can be either functions or controllers, right? So that it will be a mix, and they are, I think they are these independent entities that act based on the conditions, right? So that's what we are or have done for R1. I see the way to do vendor plugins. There is two ways. One is that they are part of the hydration process and that they have functions or controller that are happening at the hydration, or the alternative is that that this will be a generic hydration that is vendor independent. And then once you go to the workload cluster, you actually, the operator that the vendor has is going to make it vendor specific. I think these are the flavors or the options that we have potentially, or at least that's the one that I can
Right, but if the vendor wants to do shift left work, then it would have to
and it's yeah.
happen here. So yeah, so that's why I'm not exactly sure how it could work. It could be a sequence, that is, our generic controller does its work first and then hands it off to the next phase where there's another controller, or some kind of integrated work where you actually do it together. So I don't think we're quite sure about that. That's something we need to tease out, I think.
Agreed.
So the way I see that working, like I actually think we kind of have that solved already. So like Wim said, there's two points of two ways of modifying the function configuration, or the network, the package configuration. One is through KRM functions. So KRM functions are very simple things, kind of like your kplug, where they take a bunch of resources in and they spit a bunch of resources out, and you can do whatever you want to them as long as you're hermetic. And then controllers are the same thing, but they add a bunch of the ability to reach out to the outside world, which adds a bunch of things like, oh, you need to, worry about failures and manage status and all this stuff. So those 2 points, the idea is that you can add, the package author can add anything they want to that, and that means the vendor is one of the package authors, right? The package is constructed by vendor and organization together, and the vendor or people in the organization can add those KRM functions, or if they have things that need to gather not runtime but config time, sort of what we're calling shifted left, but needs to interact with the rest of the world, like we're doing with IPAM, they can add a controller if they have vendor specific things in that area. Now we can work to make it easier to build controllers. We can work to make it a little easier to build functions, although they're sort of very little, like little configlet type things anyway. So I'm not sure that we need an additional insertion point. So we have the ones that are built into the package. So those are those are to run every time you make a modification to the package. Those KRM functions. We did talk about the package variant. We're talking about the package variant resource, which is what potentially being able to execute a different set of functions that would work a little differently from a pipeline perspective. And then you have the follow-on stuff after fan out, where the package condition doesn't even have to be after fan out. Any package can take advantage of all the condition stuff, which is a coordinated post draft configuration. So I'm not sure we need an additional lever in there, but I mean, I'm open to it if we think so.
Yeah, I think it's worth discussing or going a bit deeper upon on different options, probably, I think,
Sure.
John. So we have to look at all the flavor, because I think it's something that I think we discussed it before, that we should answer rather sooner than later in terms of how a vendor plugs in, because a lot of people have already asked questions on how it would work. So I think it would be, okay, let's first have baseline established, and then we can work on how that would work. But I think we have various ways. So it's what I like at the current proposal is we are not limiting ourselves to one way or another. We have various insertion points on how it can work, and I think that's already nice.
Yeah, and just before Tim goes, I'll just say two more things. I didn't mention, of course, the operator side of things. That's also there too. There's also what we call apply time. So that's before the operator kicks. It's like at the time you apply the resources to the Kubernetes workload cluster, you can do stuff. So webhooks are an example of how you do apply time, but we can actually do. And then we're also talking about how we integrate each of these insertion points with Helm. So we are having another discussion on another, and we could, because I know there's existing investment in Helm. And so and that's one mechanism for doing this kind of config manipulation. So we can plug it in at different parts of that flow. But I do agree that I have an old diagram that talks about here are the life cycle of a package, and here are the insertion points where we can make mutations. And so I would suggest we go back to that and see if what I've described there is sufficient or if there's more we need. Tim.
Yeah, so I'll let you guys finish your question on controllers. I had a question on the NAD creation.
Oh, okay. I think we're done.
Yeah,
Are there
it's,
other questions on controllers?
it's more or less done. I did. We can go
Yeah,
back.
so good. No, go down to your last page there, Wim, because it's just a question.
This one?
No, keep going to the last page.
This
Yep,
one?
there you go. Okay, so you say, lastly, a NAD is created which defines the specific parameters needed for the interface and attachments to the NF. So how does that NAD that you just created, how does that get correlated back to the request that you made? Is it by the name of the network instance? Is that how you're doing that binding, or are you going to inject the NAD identifier?
So the way it works today is the controller that sits in the workload cluster, right?
Mhm.
So the way network attachment definition work is through an annotation within the pod, right? So what happens is when the operator or controller that sits in the workload cluster injects that annotation that references the NAT into it, and that's how they bind. So here we just pull it down, but the controller that lives in the workload cluster, or at least that's how we did it in the POC, is that when the pod gets created that represents this, will do that annotation, and as a result, that's how network attachment, I call it the late binding, is
So
working.
the binding doesn't occur here because you said
Oh.
lastly a NAD is created and defines, right?
Yeah, and the binding happens at the workload cluster level. Yeah.
Okay, so the creation of the NAD and the binding happens in the workload cluster, right?
Yeah. So this is
Yeah,
basically
I didn't get that from this, right? I didn't know what you're exactly trying to do.
okay. So at the moment, what we are doing is that so what's actually in the package is actually all of it, but there is actually two CRs in the package that are relevant for the workload cluster. The one is the UPF deployment that is here, right? And there is, if you look to the, there is one for every network attachment that you saw before here, for these, right? We create, so these ones, we create a NAT with, and so this was a discussion before whether to do shift left or shift right, right? But at the moment in the shift left model, like the VLAN, the CNI type, the version, all of these things gets hydrated in the management cluster, but it's not yet applied. So it's basically, here is a CR that is that would be in the workload cluster, be implemented and applied to the cluster. So then when that is hydrated and approved by the person to say, hey, I'm okay with this, then it's config sync takes that, applies it to the cluster, because so the way that these CAP packages work, so all of DCRs, they have an annotation or a label, I forgot, to say this configuration is not to be applied to the cluster. So there is a specific key value that represents, hey, this can be applied to or the cluster or not. And config sync uses that to know whether to apply or not, right? But basically, from this package, network attachment definitions that we were talking about, as well as the UPF deployment, are the two CRs that actually will be used at the workload cluster and then applied, and then that late binding happens there, but it's not happening here. So this is basically content that we prepare in a package per cluster, per NF type.
Okay, so go back down to the UPF deployment. I'm just trying to make sure I understand. When that light binding happens, right? What changes in this particular, let's just take N6, right? What changes, what will happen, what will change
So
in this when you do the late binding?
So what happens basically, this UPF deployment at the
Mm.
workload cluster is input to an operator that is a free 5GC operator.
Right.
That operator creates a deployment specifically to all the requirements that came here.
Mm-hmm.
In that deployment, in the pod spec, you basically build that annotation, that late binding reference, right? And
Okay.
that's how then the free 5GC gets spun up, right? And because we have that annotation in the deployment spec and in the pod, that's how the late binding happens through the multis. We use standard multis mechanisms to do so.
So does the CR either as part of the spec or the status that's in the workload cluster, does it have that correlation between, we're talking about N6 here, the N6 and the NAD that it was bound to?
Yes, so it has a reference to it, yeah.
Okay, and it's just not shown here. That's
Oh, no,
that's what I was that's what I was trying to drive.
Yeah, so we have to add that. So I stopped at the management cluster, so we have to add the part of the workload cluster.
Got it. Okay, I'm good. I was just like, that was the last cookie. I couldn't find the drift.
Yeah, we have to add that. Yeah.
All right, man. Thanks.
All right. So I think okay, we have a small team, so we probably does anyone have major objections to this framework? Of course, there will probably some details that we have to flush out on some of these things, because the whole idea is that we would send this document. Maybe we can remove the example if people believe that, or we send this document as is to SIG1. We probably will have to represent it probably in one of our meetings, I think, John, given the amount of people that we have here, probably we should spend some time on it. But if anyone has major objections against what is on the table here, because that would allow us to make progress, because from the way I look at it, this is kind of fundamental in how we progress, because all our work is probably depending on it. That doesn't mean that every CR, how it's defined here, cannot change and we can split it apart. But I think it's what's most important is the framework that sits behind.
I think it's a great starting point in my view.
Yeah. Thanks, Nala. Yeah. So, okay, then I propose that we send it to SIG1, right? And then we plan some additional effort for review within our SIG automation as part of the regular meetings. And then we take it from there. Yeah.
So I will, yes, agreed. Now, that's part of it. Well, that's part of it anyway. So the question is, how is SIG1 going to understand this? How do we explain it? Do we want to, we can send it as is. Do we want to set up they have a meeting on Monday. I don't know if they plan to do this, if we need a separate meeting with people that are interested, because maybe it's too big of a group. We should think about the logistics of it, I guess. There's a lot of context that this group has that they don't have. So like, it's like, how many hours are we going to spend trying to explain it?
But I think, yeah, so okay, in the meeting, I think you were not there on Tuesday this week, John. So, but I basically told them that we are working on this.
Okay.
That we would send this. And of course, I told them that we would present. We wanted to present this because
okay,
there is so much content. So that was what I suggested to them. And I think they were okay with that approach.
Okay, awesome.
Yes, just to let you know, there is no SIG meeting next week, at least on the calendar.
Oh,
it's once in 2 weeks.
Oh, good. That gives us, okay, good. That gives us more time. I was worried, like, I'd like to have like some example packages.
Okay.
We can work on that next week, but see, we can send this document as is and just say, we're working on more examples to show concretely how this is how we operationalize this. Like, I think that will make it, it's still pretty abstract. And so like, I think that will make it a lot clearer if we can do that.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
so they
I
can-
think Bala, they also said that they would meet more regularly. But you're right, is there's not there hasn't been any invitation sent out. But
Yeah,
during
they haven't
exactly.
finalized that. No.
Yeah.
Well, besides, they're also not using the PMO admin account.
oh, we have to
Yeah.
Gosh, we have to
So
help.
you can't just out of the blue schedule your own meeting. not from our side. You
Yeah,
have
we
to go
need
through
to
NFA,
help them with the
RFA.
logistics a little bit to get
Yeah.
so they understand how to do it. But okay, Wim, are we all set then?
Yeah, I think that's it. I really appreciate everybody's feedback. Yeah, yeah. And I would like to thank all of the people. So this is, by the way, not my work. So this is input from various people, right? So thanks everyone for helping. So this is actually community effort, if you will. But yeah.
Well, thank you, Wim, for coordinating and leading this effort. So that's
Absolutely.
critical.
Thanks, everyone. John, I mean, if I may ask a question, I'll raise a hand and ask a question. So what does this mean for the sequence diagram that we discussed? Does it change anything at all?
It's a great question. So what I'm thinking is that now that we have this, we can think through, and I hope to make, and I'd love for anybody else to do this too, but I was thinking this afternoon, if I have time, I'm going to think through what the implications of this are on the little task forces or whatever we wanted to do. Like we probably want a task force specifically around how we define these different requirements. I think Tal's super interested in that. We also going to want a task force around this piece we just talked about of like, what are the insertion points for customization along the way, you know? So like the hydration side of things. So I mean, one way we could divide it is management cluster and workload cluster. I don't know if that's sufficiently granular, but like we should think it through and see what, but I think we should, like I said before, land on somewhere between 3 and 6 task forces that can kind of take those things that we put on the board, Bala, and kind of refine them, take ownership of, and we'll create area labels, we'll assign areas, and we'll assign some team leads in those areas, and people who are interested in those areas can gravitate towards them. Maybe we'll create Slack channels for them. Like we'll execute those semi-independently, right? That's the whole idea, is that we shouldn't all have to talk about everything all the time.
We are very hierarchical at the moment. If we want to make progress, we have to be more divide and conquer, I think. So this would allow us to do so.
Yeah. Does that
Yeah.
answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I think we better go. I'm late for another meeting.
Yeah, thanks all. I'll stop the recording.
All right, bye-bye.
All right.